The stagecoach groaned like a dying man with every rut in the road, its wooden bones protesting the hard, unforgiving land. Clara clutched the worn handle of her satchel, the knuckles of her free hand white against the rough fabric of her traveling dress. For 3 days, she had been swallowed by the vast, dust-choked emptiness of the plains, a rolling sea of brown grass and boundless sky that promised nothing but more of itself. Now, through the grime-caked window, the town of Coldridge finally took shape, a ragged collection of unpainted buildings huddled together against the ceaseless wind. As if for comfort, it looked less like a town and more like a scar on the face of the earth. This was to be her home. This was where Thomas Radley lived. Clara, at 22, still carried the quiet hope of a girl who had known only the green, gentle hills of Ohio. Her world had been one of church socials, neatly tilled fields, and the familiar scent of rain on damp earth. Coldridge smelled of dust, manure, and something sharp and metallic, like old blood. She smoothed the front of her dress, a futile gesture against the grit that had settled into every fold and fiber. She knew what people thought of arranged marriages, a cold transaction, a bartering of a woman's future for a man's security. But her father's death had left her and her mother with little else. The letters from Thomas Radley, heir to the Radley Mercantile, had been brief and formal, but they spoke of a prosperous future, of building a life in her heart, where hope was a stubborn weed. Clara had allowed herself to imagine more. She had imagined a partner, a companion against the loneliness of this wild country. She had pictured a hand to hold, a quiet strength to lean on. The coach lurched to a halt in front of a long, low building that declared itself the Radley Mercantile in faded black paint. A man stepped out from the shadows of the porch, and, for a disorienting moment, Clara thought he was older than the 30 years he claimed. But as he drew closer, she saw it was not age that marked him, but a kind of weary impatience. Thomas Radley was handsome in a severe, sharp-angled way, with dark hair combed flat and eyes the color of a winter sky. He did not smile as he took her hand to help her down. His touch was cool and brief, a formality dispensed with. "Miss Covington," he said, his voice as devoid of warmth as his eyes, "you have arrived." It was not a welcome, it was a statement of fact. "Mr. Radley," she replied, her voice a near whisper, lost in the wind that whipped a strand of her brown hair across her face. "It is good to finally meet you." He merely nodded, his gaze sweeping over her, not with the appreciation of a groom-to-be, but with the detached assessment of a merchant examining goods. He seemed to take in her simple dress, the scuffed toes of her boots, the tired lines around her eyes, and find them all wanting. The small, hopeful flame in Clara's chest flickered and shrank. The wedding took place 2 days later. There was no time for courtship, no pretense of romance. The town, Thomas had explained, expected it. The ceremony was a stark, public affair in the town's only church, a drafty structure that still smelled of raw pine. Clara wore a simple white dress her mother had sewn, its delicate lace trim a fragile protest against the grit of her new reality. She had no family present, no friends to stand beside her. There were only the curious, hardened faces of the townspeople of Coldridge, their eyes watching her every move. The women's gazes were a mixture of pity and appraisal, the men's something more direct, more unsettling. Clara's hands trembled as she stood beside Thomas at the altar. She could feel the chill coming off him, a palpable coldness that had nothing to do with the autumn air. He stood ramrod straight, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the pastor as if he were concluding a business deal. When he placed the thin gold band on her finger, his touch was as impersonal as a handshake. He spoke his vows in a flat monotone, the words of love and devotion rendered hollow and meaningless. When the pastor declared them man and wife, and Thomas turned to kiss her, it was a brief, dry press of lips against her own, a seal on a contract. The hope that had sustained her across 1,000 miles of wilderness finally withered and died, leaving a cold, heavy stone in its place. Later, in the small room he had rented for them above the saloon, the pretense fell away entirely. The room was stuffy, loud with the raucous laughter and tinny piano music from below. Thomas did not look at her. He paced the floorboards, his new wedding band gleaming in the lamplight. "I have business to attend to," he announced abruptly, stopping to pull on his coat. "An urgent shipment. I must see to it." Clara sat on the edge of the bed, her white dress pooling around her, feeling small and foolish. "Tonight? On our wedding night?" He finally looked at her, and the coldness in his eyes was now mingled with something else, a flash of irritation, of cruel contempt that made her flinch. "The world does not stop for a wedding. Clara, this is a busy town. A man has responsibilities." He picked up his hat and a small, heavy leather satchel from the dresser. She recognized it instantly. It was the satchel containing her dowry, the entirety of her inheritance, the money that was supposed to help them start their life together. "You will need that?" she asked, a knot of dread tightening in her stomach. "For the shipment," he said, his voice sharp. He walked to the door, then paused, his hand on the knob. He did not turn around. "Do not wait up for me." The door clicked shut behind him. Clara sat frozen, listening to his footsteps fade down the hall and then disappear down the stairs. She waited. She told herself it was just as he said, business. This was the West. A man's work was hard and demanding. She smoothed the wrinkles from her dress and folded her hands in her lap. A perfect picture of a patient bride. The piano music downstairs played on, a relentless, cheerful mockery. An hour passed, then 2. The music from the saloon died down, replaced by the occasional shout and the sound of a breaking bottle. Clara rose and walked to the window, peering down into the dark, muddy street. There was no sign of him. The knot of dread in her stomach grew colder, heavier. She lay down on the bed, still in her wedding dress, her mind a frantic whirl of excuses and fears. He would be back. He had to come back. He was her husband. But the night bled into the cold, gray hours before dawn, and the bed beside her remained empty. When the first weak light of morning seeped through the dirty window pane, a horrifying certainty settled over her. She rose on numb legs and went to the small wardrobe in the corner. His clothes were gone. His shaving kit was gone. The only things left in the room were her own meager belongings and the suffocating scent of his bay rum cologne. He had vanished, and he had taken her dowry with him. The news spread through Coldridge like a prairie fire. It did not creep in whispers. It galloped in open speculation and scornful laughter. By midday, Clara was no longer a bride. She was a cautionary tale, a public spectacle. The story, pieced together from the stable boy who'd sold Thomas a fresh horse and the teller at the bank who knew of Radley's debts, was simple and brutal. Thomas Radley had been a fraud, a man drowning in gambling losses who had seen a desperate woman from back east as his last, best chance. He had married her for her dowry and fled, leaving her ruined. Humiliation was a physical thing. It was a heat that flushed her cheeks and a tremor in her hands. It was the way the floorboards of the mercantile seemed to tilt beneath her feet when she dared to go downstairs. The clerk, a boy of no more than 17, could not meet her eyes. Whispers followed her like shadows. She could hear them from the women gathered around the pickle barrel, their voices cutting and sharp. Poor fool. What did she expect? Answering an advertisement like that? They say he never even, just took the money and ran. Must be something wrong with her, for a man to do that. The men were worse. Their leering stares were like grubby hands on her skin, stripping her of what little dignity she had left. They saw her not as a victim, but as damaged goods, an object of public property, available for their amusement and speculation. Their eyes held a predatory gleam, a coarse understanding that she was now a woman with no husband, no money, and no protection. Her shame was a cage, and every corner of the small town was a bar. For 2 days, she stayed in the room above the saloon, the landlord's pity turning quickly to impatience. On the 3rd day, he told her she had until sundown to pay for another week or be out on the street. With a heart full of dread, she walked to the church, her last hope. Surely the pastor, the man who had joined her in unholy matrimony, would offer some Christian charity. It was the pastor's wife, a woman with a face like a clenched fist, who met her at the door of the parsonage. Her eyes, small and hard as pebbles, raked over Clara's worn dress. "We have no room for you here," she said before Clara could even speak. "Please," Clara whispered, her voice cracking. "I have nowhere to go, just for a night or two, until I can figure out what to do." "The church provides for the worthy poor," the woman stated, her voice sharp with judgment. "Not for women of your situation. You have brought scandal and shame upon this town. Your presence here would be an affront." She looked Clara up and down one last time, a flicker of disgust in her eyes. "Whatever you did to drive that man away is your own burden to bear." The door closed in her face, the solid thud echoing the final, slamming door in her soul. That was it. She was utterly, completely alone, worthless, an outcast. As dusk settled, painting the sky in bruises of purple and orange, Clara walked out of Coldridge. She did not look back. The landlord had taken her satchel to cover her bill, leaving her with only the clothes on her back. At the edge of town, her worn-out shoes, never meant for such harsh terrain, finally gave out, the soul of one tearing loose. Without a thought, she kicked them both off, leaving them in the dust. The cold ground shocked her bare feet, the sharp edges of gravel biting into her skin, but the pain was distant, unimportant. It was nothing compared to the gaping wound in her heart. She walked on, barefoot, into the descending night, with no destination but the desolate, empty road that stretched into the blackness of the plains. The world dissolved into a blur of pain and cold. She did not know how long she walked. The moon rose, a cold silver disk in an ocean of stars, offering no warmth, only a pale, ghostly light. Her feet were bleeding now, her legs aching with a weariness that went bone deep. A creek bed, choked with dry weeds and smooth, cold stones, appeared before her. She stumbled toward it, desperate for water, but found only a trickle of half-frozen mud. She collapsed onto the frozen bank, her body finally refusing to obey. The last of her strength drained away, leaving her hollow and trembling. The wind howled around her, a lonely, grieving sound that seemed to be coming from inside her own chest. She curled into a tight ball, her simple dress a poor defense against the biting cold, and surrendered to the encroaching darkness. Elias saw the patch of white against the dark earth from 100 yards away. It did not belong. His hand went instinctively to the Colt Peacemaker holstered at his hip as he urged his horse. Flint, forward. In his 10 years on this homestead, he had learned that anything out of the ordinary was usually trouble. As he drew closer, the white patch resolved itself into the shape of a woman, curled up by the creek bed that marked the edge of his property. She was either dead or close to it. He dismounted, his boots sinking into the hard, cold ground. He was a man built of lean muscle and hard-won silence, his face a roadmap of a difficult life. A long, jagged scar ran from his right temple down to his jaw, a stark white line against his sun-darkened skin. His eyes, a pale, faded blue, held a permanent watchfulness, the look of a man who had seen too much and expected nothing good. He knelt beside her, his movements cautious. She was young, her face pale as milk in the moonlight, smudged with dirt and tear tracks. Her brown hair was a tangled mess, and her feet, he grunted softly when he saw her feet. They were bruised, cut, and blue with cold. She was alive, her breathing shallow and ragged. For a long moment, he considered his options. He could leave her. It was not his trouble. This land was full of people whose stories ended badly. Bringing her in would mean questions, complications, a disruption to the rigid, solitary peace he had carved out for himself. But then a gust of wind lifted a strand of her hair, and he saw the frozen tears clinging to her lashes. He saw the thin gold band on her finger, and he saw something else. Something in the hopeless curve of her mouth that echoed a sorrow he knew all too well. With a sigh that seemed to rise from the deepest part of him, he made his decision. He was hesitant, his touch gruff as he slipped his arms beneath her. She was lighter than he expected, a fragile bundle of bones and cold flesh. She stirred, moaning softly, but did not wake as he lifted her. He carried her back to his cabin, his long strides eating up the distance. The cabin was a single room, stark and meticulously clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. Its hearth swept clean. A narrow bed was tucked into one corner, a rough-hewn table and 2 chairs in the center. It was the home of a man who owned little and wanted less. He laid her gently on his own bed, the only one he had, and pulled the heavy wool blanket over her. She shivered violently, her teeth chattering. He moved with a quiet efficiency, his anger at the situation warring with a reluctant sense of duty. He built a fire, the kindling catching quickly, the flames spitting and crackling to life, pushing back the oppressive cold. He filled a kettle with water from a bucket by the door and set it on a hook over the fire. He found a clean cloth and a basin, and without ceremony, he began to clean the cuts on her feet. She whimpered in her sleep as he worked, her body still trembling. She refused to speak of what happened, at least at first. When she finally woke, the fire was roaring and the first flakes of snow were swirling past the single window. Her eyes, the color of moss after a rain, were wide with fear and confusion. She stared at him, at his scarred face and the gun on his hip, and tried to shrink back into the bed. "Where am I?" she whispered, her voice raw. "My cabin," he answered, his voice a low rumble. He did not move closer, not wanting to frighten her more. "Found you by the creek. You were half frozen." He offered her a cup of hot water, which she took with a trembling hand. She drank it slowly, the warmth seeming to thaw something inside her. But when he asked her name, she only shook her head, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. When he asked where she came from, she turned her face to the wall. He did not ask again. He sensed the pain was a wild, wounded thing, and pushing at it would only make it worse. He let her be, offering space instead of questions. The snow began to fall in earnest, a thick, silent curtain that blotted out the world, isolating the small cabin in a sea of white. The world outside grew quiet, the only sound the mournful howl of the wind as it rattled the wooden shutters. Elias moved about the cabin, his presence a solid, silent thing. He checked on his horse in the lean-to, chopped more wood, and cooked a thin stew of salted pork and beans. He ate his portion at the table, leaving a bowl for her on a stool by the fire. She watched him from the shadows of the bed, a silent observer of this strange, scarred man. He moved with a heavy grace, his shoulders bowed as if by an invisible weight. There was a profound sadness in his hands, in the way he mended a piece of leather tack or stared into the flames of the fire. His silence was not empty. It was full of things unsaid, of a history he did not share. The cabin was cold, but the fire he had built held the worst of it at bay. It was a small pocket of warmth in a world that had suddenly become impossibly cold. As night fell, a deeper chill settled into Clara's bones, one that had nothing to do with the weather. It was the chill of utter desolation. The life she had imagined, the future she had hoped for, had been a lie, a cruel trick. She was nothing. She had nothing. She was a ghost, haunting the cabin of a stranger, under the thick wool blanket, hidden in the darkness. She let the silent tears fall, hot against her cold skin. They traced paths through the grime on her cheeks as she wept for her lost hope, for her shattered pride, for the girl she had been only days ago. The wind outside howled like a soul in grief, and it was a sound she understood. "Please," she whispered into the scratchy wool, her voice so soft it was little more than a breath. "Please do not let me break." The days that followed were measured not in hours, but in the slow, rhythmic cadence of survival. A world of white and gray settled outside the cabin, the snow muffling all sound, creating an illusion of peace that felt both profound and terrifyingly fragile. Inside, another kind of quiet reigned. They moved around each other in the small space with a careful, unspoken courtesy. Clara, her feet now bandaged with clean rags, took it upon herself to sweep the hearth, to knead what little flour they had into dense, heavy bread, to mend a tear in one of Elias's shirts with thread she painstakingly pulled from the hem of her petticoat. She worked with a silent, desperate focus, as if keeping her hands busy could keep the screaming in her soul at bay. Elias did not press her. He rose before dawn each morning, the scrape of his boots on the floorboards her signal that another day had begun. He would tend to his horse, check his trap lines, and return with a frozen rabbit or two, his scarred face impassive against the biting wind. He ate his meals without a word, but he always made sure her plate was full first. He never looked at her for too long, yet she felt his awareness of her in the room, a steady, unobtrusive presence. He gave her the one thing no one else had, the gift of space, the dignity of her own silence. He did not ask for her story, sensing it was a burden too heavy for words, a fresh wound that would tear open if prodded. One evening, the rhythm shifted. The relentless work of staying alive required a constant supply of firewood, and Elias spent the hours before sunset swinging his axe, the rhythmic thud and crack echoing in the cold, still air. Clara stood in the doorway of the cabin, watching him. His movements were economical and powerful, his body a study in lean strength. Sweat glistened on his brow despite the cold, and the muscles in his back and shoulders coiled and released beneath his worn flannel shirt. She watched the way he worked, the focus in his pale eyes, and saw not just a man chopping wood, but a man warring with something inside himself, each swing of the axe a blow against a silent, unseen enemy. He must have felt her gaze. He stopped, his axe buried deep in a half-split log, and turned to look at her. His expression was unreadable. For a long moment, they just stood there, separated by 20 yards of trampled snow and a chasm of unspoken pain. Then, in a gesture that startled her, he pulled the axe free and held it out to her. Handle first. It was not a challenge, but an invitation. Hesitantly, she walked towards him, her bandaged feet sinking into the snow. The axe was heavier than she'd imagined, its wooden handle worn smooth by his hands. He showed her how to stand, how to place her feet, how to let the weight of the head do the work. "Do not fight it," he said, his voice a low rumble. The first words he had spoken to her all day that were not strictly necessary. "Just guide it." Her first swing was clumsy, glancing off the side of the log with a dull thwack. A nervous flush crept up her neck. She expected him to scoff, to take the axe back with an impatient sigh. Instead, he simply reset the log. "Again," he said. She tried again, putting all her frustration, all her shame, all her fury into the swing. The blade bit deep into the wood with a satisfying crunch. She managed a few more swings before her arms began to ache and her breath came in ragged gasps. Leaning on the axe handle, she looked up at him, a thin sheen of sweat on her own face, and for the first time, she saw the ghost of a smile touch the corners of his mouth. It was a small, fleeting thing, gone almost as soon as it appeared, but it changed his entire face, softening the hard lines and easing the sorrow in his eyes. Without thinking, she smiled back. It was a weak, watery smile, but it was real, in that shared moment of hard work and physical exertion. breathing in the sharp scent of pine and cold air. A tiny, fragile thread of connection was spun between them. Later that night, sitting by the fire, the thread began to unspool. The silence in the cabin was different now, less a barrier and more a shared space. He was cleaning his rifle, his large hands surprisingly deft with the small, intricate parts. She was stitching a patch onto the knee of his trousers. The simple, domestic act, the warmth of the fire, the safety of these four walls, it all combined to loosen the knot of terror in her chest. "My name is Clara," she said, her voice quiet, testing the sound of it in the room. He stopped his work and looked at her, his pale eyes catching the firelight. He nodded slowly. "Elias." Just the exchange of names, nothing more. But it was enough. The words, held back for so long, began to spill out of her, a torrent of broken sentences and half-finished thoughts. She told him about the journey, about the coldness in Thomas Radley's eyes, about the public wedding and the private, crushing humiliation of the empty room. Shame was a hot poker in her throat, and she could barely meet his gaze as she spoke of the whispers, the leers, the final, cruel rejection at the pastor's door. She spoke until her voice was raw, until the whole ugly, sordid story lay bare between them in the flickering firelight. She finished, her shoulders trembling, and waited for his reaction. She expected disgust, perhaps a cold, hard judgment. She was, after all, a ruined woman, a fool who had been cast aside. What she saw in his face, however, was none of those things. There was no pity, no revulsion. There was only a profound, quiet understanding, a sorrow that seemed to recognize her own. He set aside his rifle and leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. 5 years ago, he began, his voice low and raspy, as if dragged up from a deep, painful place. "I had a wife, Sarah, and a son, Daniel. He was 4 years old." He stared into the flames, but Clara knew he was seeing something else entirely. "I was away, selling some furs. Should have only been gone 2 days, but a storm blew in. I was delayed. While I was gone, raiders came through. They weren't looking to settle, just to burn and take what they could. They set fire to the cabin." He paused, and his throat worked as he swallowed. "My neighbor found them. It was too late. I should have been here." He looked at his hands, turning them over as if he did not recognize them. "I never forgave myself for not being home." The confession hung in the air, a grief so immense it seemed to suck the very warmth from the fire. His story did not diminish hers. It enveloped it. He had not just listened to her shame, he had met it with his own unbearable guilt. In that moment, they were no longer a man and a woman, a rescuer and a victim. They were two people bound by the common, brutal language of loss, two souls scarred by a world that took without asking and without reason. The days that followed were different. The silence was now comfortable, punctuated by small, shared moments. They began to cook side by side, their hands occasionally brushing as they reached for the same utensil, a spark of warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. He showed her how to set a snare, and she taught him a song her mother used to sing, her soft voice strange and beautiful in the rustic cabin. One evening, he told a dry, funny story about a stubborn mule, and she laughed, a genuine, bubbling sound that startled them both. He stopped talking and just stared at her, a look of wonder on his face, as if he'd forgotten what laughter sounded like. They began to find a fragile peace in their shared solitude, two small points of light against the vast, indifferent darkness of the plains. But the cabin could not remain an island forever. Their supplies dwindled until their meals became repetitive and meager. They needed flour, salt, coffee, lard. They needed the things that could only be found in town. "I will go," Clara announced one morning, her jaw set with a new determination. "You have done enough for me. It is my turn to contribute." Elias looked at her, his expression grim. "They will not be kind to you there." "I am not asking for kindness," she replied. her voice steady. "I am just asking for flour." He did not argue further, but he insisted she take Flint. As she rode towards Coldridge, a cold dread warred with her resolve. The town looked just as she remembered, a collection of grim buildings hunkered under a gray sky. As she dismounted in front of the mercantile, she felt the familiar stares, the immediate halt of conversations. The whispers started before she even had her foot on the porch. This time, however, the whispers were louder, crueler. Her story had become town legend, embellished with lurid details. They said she was living with a scarred man out on the plains, that she was his property now. "There she is," one woman hissed to another, just loud enough for Clara to hear. "The whore bride." The insult struck her with the force of a physical blow, stealing her breath. She kept her head high, her back straight, and walked into the store. The clerk, the same boy who had avoided her gaze before, now looked at her with a smirk. "Come back for another wedding?" he asked, snickering. Clara ignored him, her voice tight as she listed the items she needed. As she was paying with the few coins Elias had given her, the pastor's wife entered the store. The woman's face tightened into a mask of righteous indignation. "Have you no shame?" she demanded, her voice ringing through the silent store. "First, you bring disgrace upon us with your scandalous wedding, and now you parade yourself about, living in sin with that hermit? You must have done something truly wicked to drive poor Thomas Radley away." Clara's control finally snapped. "Thomas Radley was a thief and a liar," she said, her voice trembling with rage. "He is the one who should be ashamed, not I." The woman gasped, clutching her pearls. "The devil has clearly taken root in your heart. You are a lost soul." Clara grabbed her bags and fled, the woman's condemnations following her out into the street. She scrambled onto Flint's back, her eyes blurred with tears of fury and humiliation, and galloped out of town, not stopping until the ugly buildings were a smudge on the horizon. Elias found her an hour later, not far from the homestead. She had slumped forward in the saddle, the reins loose in her hands, her body shaking with silent sobs. He rode up alongside her and gently took the reins, leading her the rest of the way home without a word. That night, she could not eat. She sat on a stool by the fire, wrapped in a blanket, staring into the flames but seeing only the hateful faces of the townsfolk. The warmth of the cabin felt like a lie, a temporary reprieve from a world that was determined to brand her, to break her. Elias sat at the table, watching her. Finally, she turned to him, her eyes wide and full of a desperate, aching confusion. "Why?" she whispered, her voice a raw plea. "Why is kindness so rare, Elias?" It was a question he had no answer for. He had seen the cruelty of men, the casual brutality of nature, the indifference of fate. He had no words of comfort, no easy platitudes to offer, so he did the only thing he could. He got up from the table, took the stool beside hers, and simply sat with her. He did not touch her. He did not speak. He just sat, a solid, unwavering presence in the darkness, a silent guardian against the howling grief of the world. He sat there long after the fire had burned down to embers, long after her trembling had subsided, and long after she had finally cried herself to sleep. Her head slumped against his shoulder. The next morning, a fragile light filtered through the window, promising a day clear of snow. Elias was preparing to head out, pulling on his heavy coat. Clara was by the hearth, stoking the morning fire. He turned to leave, and she moved towards him, her heart overflowing with a gratitude so fierce it felt like an ache. He had not offered words, but he had given her something far more precious: his steadfast, silent company. He had shared the weight of her sorrow. Before she could think, before she could lose her nerve, she rose on her toes and pressed her lips to his. It was a brief, clumsy kiss, chaste and impulsive, meant only as a thank you. But the effect on him was instantaneous and startling. He went rigid, his entire body freezing as if she had touched him with a hot iron. He took a sharp step back, away from her, his hand flying up as if to ward her off. A look of raw panic, of sheer terror, flashed in his eyes before being replaced by a shuttered, unreadable expression. The rejection was so swift, so absolute, that it stole the air from her lungs. The warmth of her gratitude turned instantly to the cold, familiar sting of shame. "I am sorry," she stammered, her face burning. "I did not mean, I should not have—" She turned away, unable to bear the look on his face, her own impulsive act now feeling like another brazen, unforgivable transgression. He said nothing. A moment later, she heard the cabin door open and close, and he was gone. That night, sleep offered Elias no escape. He was back in the smoke, the world a nightmare of orange and black. The heat was a living thing, searing his lungs, melting his skin. He could hear the crackle and roar of the flames, the splintering of beams. But worst of all was the sound of her voice, screaming his name. "Elias! Elias!" It was Sarah, her voice raw with terror, a sound that had been burned into his memory. He tried to run towards it, to fight his way through the wall of fire, but his legs were made of lead. He could not reach her. He could only stand there, helpless, as the screams grew fainter and then were swallowed by the roar of the inferno. He woke with a guttural cry, sitting bolt upright on his makeshift bed on the floor. The cabin was dark and cold, the fire long dead. His face was wet. He touched his cheek, his fingers coming away damp, and realized with a jolt of distant surprise that he was weeping. The silent tears he had held back for 5 long years were finally tracking paths through the dust and grime on his face, silent testament to a wound that had never, not for a single day, stopped bleeding. The aftermath of her impulsive kiss was a chasm of awkward silence that stretched for days. Elias became more withdrawn than ever, his movements around the cabin stiff and deliberate, his gaze always fixed on some distant point beyond the walls. He avoided her eyes, and the easy companionship they had begun to build crumbled into a strained, formal courtesy. Clara, mortified and ashamed, retreated into herself, convinced she had shattered the fragile trust between them, mistaking a moment of shared humanity for something it was not. The cabin, once a refuge, now felt small and suffocating, thick with unspoken regret. But the land, indifferent to human sorrow, began to change. A slow, grudging thaw set in. The monolithic blanket of snow began to recede, revealing patches of damp, dark earth. The relentless wind lost some of its biting edge, carrying on it the faintest promise of pine and wet soil. And just as the landscape began to emerge from its frozen slumber, so too did something in Clara. She could not undo her mistake, but she could not remain a ghost in this man's home forever. The shame that had paralyzed her began to give way to a quiet, stubborn resolve. She had survived. That, in itself, was a small, hard miracle. Now, she had to learn how to live. Her mending began not with a grand gesture, but with small, defiant acts of creation. She found a bolt of faded calico cloth in an old trunk, the last remnant of Sarah's life, a fact she understood without him having to say it. With a needle and thread, she began to sew curtains for the single, stark window. The work was slow, her stitches uneven, but with each pass of the needle, she felt as if she were stitching a piece of herself back together. When she was finished, she hung them from a string. They were simple, uneven things, but they softened the harsh afternoon light, transforming the cabin from a temporary shelter into something that resembled a home. Elias said nothing when he saw them, but that evening, she saw him touch the edge of the fabric as he passed, a brief, almost imperceptible gesture of acknowledgement. One afternoon, she found him cleaning his rifle, the weapon a symbol of the violence and self-reliance this land demanded. "Teach me," she said, her voice clear and steady. He looked up, surprised. "Teach me how to use that." He hesitated, his eyes searching her face. He saw not fear or fragility, but a new, steely determination. He nodded slowly, and for the next week, he took her out into the cold, bright afternoons and taught her. The rifle was heavy and awkward in her arms, its cold metal a shock against her skin. The first time she fired it, the kick slammed against her shoulder, bruising her, and the deafening roar made her ears ring, but she did not back down. She learned to load, to aim, to breathe, to squeeze the trigger without flinching, under his patient, watchful eye. She learned to hit a tin can perched on a fence post from 50 yards. The smell of gunpowder became the scent of control, and the small, satisfying ping of a successful shot was the sound of her own emerging strength. In the quiet hours of the evening, when Elias was outside or lost in his own silent world, she took out a small pencil and a few sheets of precious paper. She began to write letters to her father, letters that could never be sent. Letters to a ghost. She told him everything, about the journey, about Thomas's betrayal, about the cold faces in Coldridge. But she also wrote about the vastness of the sky, the silence of the snow, and the quiet, scarred man who had saved her. "I think I am becoming a different person here. Father," she wrote one night, the pencil clutched in her hand, "the girl you raised, the one who loved wildflowers and poetry, is still here, but there is a new part of me growing. A harder, wilder part, and I do not know if I should be afraid of her." The distance between them finally began to close again the day he taught her to ride. He led Flint out from the lean-to, the horse's breath pluming in the crisp air. "A person cannot survive out here without a horse," he said, his tone practical, as if the last week of silence had never happened. He showed her how to approach, how to speak to the animal in a low, calm voice, how to saddle and bridle him. His hands brushed against hers as he adjusted the stirrups, and this time he did not pull away. He lifted her into the saddle as easily as if she were a child, perched high on the horse's back. The world looked different, wider, full of possibility. Her initial fear gave way to a thrilling sense of power. Elias led the horse around the small corral, his hand a steady presence on the bridle, his voice a low murmur of encouragement. After a while, he let go, and she was on her own. She urged Flint into a slow trot, her body learning the rhythm of the animal beneath her. A breeze picked up, whipping strands of hair from her bun and bringing a flush of color to her cheeks. She turned the horse and trotted back towards Elias, a feeling of pure, unadulterated freedom swelling in her chest. And then, without warning, a laugh escaped her lips. It was not a small, polite sound. It was a full, free, and joyous laugh, a sound of pure delight that she had thought was lost to her forever. It rang out in the quiet air, a bright, startling melody. Elias, who was standing by the fence, froze. He stared at her as she rode towards him, her face alight with a radiant, breathtaking smile, her eyes sparkling with life. It was as if the sun had broken through the clouds after a long, bleak winter. He watched her, and for the first time in 5 years, the ghosts in his heart fell silent. He simply stared, his breath caught in his throat, at the beautiful, laughing woman this broken girl was becoming. That night, the sky turned a bruised, angry purple. The wind began to howl. No longer a mournful sigh, but a furious shriek. A storm was coming, one of the violent, unpredictable squalls that could tear across the plains without warning. The air grew thick and heavy, charged with an electric tension that mirrored the unspoken energy crackling between them. The first crack of thunder sounded like the sky splitting in two. It was followed by a flash of lightning so brilliant it bleached the world white for a second. And in its immediate aftermath, they heard a sound like a rifle shot, magnified 1,000 times over. A massive cottonwood tree near the barn had been split down the middle, one half of it crashing to the ground with a tremendous roar. Inside the small barn, Flint and the 2 pack mules began to scream in terror. "The horses!" Elias yelled over the rising wind, already grabbing a lantern and pulling on his coat. Clara did not hesitate. She followed him out into the maelstrom, The wind tearing at her, the rain coming down in cold, driving sheets. The world was chaos, a symphony of roaring wind, crashing thunder, and the panicked cries of the animals. Together, they fought their way to the barn. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of fear and hay. The animals were wild-eyed, kicking at the sides of their stalls. Working as a team, moving with a desperate, unspoken understanding, they fought to calm them. Elias took Flint's bridle, speaking to him in a low, steady voice, his hand a firm presence on the horse's trembling neck. Clara went to the mules, her own fear forgotten as she focused on soothing them, her voice finding a calm she did not know she possessed. One of the mules reared, its hooves lashing out, and Elias threw himself in front of Clara, shielding her with his own body. The moment was a flash of terror and a revelation. In this chaos, his first instinct was to protect her. They managed to lead the animals out of the barn and into the relative safety of the lean-to attached to the cabin. By the time they were finished, they were both soaked to the bone, their hair plastered to their skin, their clothes heavy with rain. They stumbled back into the cabin, the door slamming shut behind them, cutting off the roar of the storm. They stood there in the sudden, ringing silence, dripping onto the floorboards, their chests heaving. The adrenaline of the past few minutes still coursed through their veins. Clara was trembling, from the cold, from the fear, from the sheer, overwhelming relief of being safe. She looked at Elias, at his scarred face illuminated by the single lantern, at the rain dripping from his dark hair, and she saw him not as a savior or a stranger, but as a partner, a man who had stood with her against the storm. A violent shiver racked her body, and without a word, she fell into his arms, burying her face in the cold, wet fabric of his shirt. It was an instinctive, desperate move, a plea for warmth and solid ground in a world that had just tried to tear itself apart. He hesitated for only a fraction of a second before his arms came around her, pulling her tight against him. His embrace was not gentle. It was as desperate as hers, a raw, elemental clutching. He was trembling, too. He held her face in his hands, his thumbs stroking the rain from her cheeks. He looked into her eyes, and she saw a storm there that was fiercer than the one raging outside, a storm of grief, of loneliness, of a desperate, forbidden hope. The moment turned, stretched taut, and then snapped. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was a kiss of raw, urgent need, a collision of two lonely souls who had forgotten the taste of comfort. It was deep and desperate, full of all the words they could not say. It was a kiss that acknowledged their shared scars, their shared sorrow, their shared will to survive. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless, the air in the cabin thick with a new, dangerous, and undeniable truth. That night, they made love. There was no gentle courtship, no soft words of romance. It was a slow, desperate, and sorrowful coming together. It was an act of profound and aching loneliness, a search for solace in a cold and unforgiving world. In the flickering firelight, they mapped the geography of each other's scars, both visible and invisible. His touch was hesitant at first, then sure, as if he were memorizing the feel of her, as if he were afraid she might vanish with the morning light. Her own hands explored the hard, lean planes of his body, the jagged scar on his face, the knots of muscle in his back. It was a silent conversation, a sharing of pain that was too deep for language. They moved together with a slow, sad rhythm, two broken people seeking a moment of wholeness, a temporary refuge from their ghosts. Afterward, as they lay tangled together under the heavy wool blankets, the storm outside finally beginning to recede, Clara began to weep. They were not the tears of shame or humiliation she had shed before. They were tears of a profound, heart-wrenching release, the breaking of a dam that had held back a flood of grief and fear. She wept for the girl she had lost, for the woman she was becoming, for the terrifying, fragile hope that was beginning to bloom in the barren landscape of her heart. Elias held her, his hand stroking her hair, his own face buried in the crook of her neck. He did not try to quiet her. He simply held her as she shook, his solid presence an anchor in the storm of her sorrow. "Hold me," she whispered, her voice a raw, broken plea against his skin. "Please, just hold me until the morning." He tightened his arms around her, a silent promise, and as he lay there, listening to the sound of her breathing slowly evening out into the rhythm of sleep, a foreign and almost forgotten feeling began to stir within him. For 5 years, he had believed he was a ghost, a man whose life had ended in a fire alongside his wife and child. He had accepted his solitary penance, his life of empty days and haunted nights. But now, holding this woman in his arms, feeling the warmth of her body, the dampness of her tears, he felt a flicker of something else. It was a dangerous, terrifying thought, but it took root in the darkness. Maybe, just maybe, he might deserve something good again. The fragile peace of their new intimacy was shattered a week later by the arrival of a visitor. A man on a sway-backed horse rode up to the cabin, a traveling preacher making his rounds through the desolate homesteads. He was a thin, severe-looking man with eyes that seemed to see sin in every shadow. He recognized Clara instantly. "You!" he exclaimed, his voice dripping with sanctimonious condemnation as she stepped out of the cabin. "The disgraced bride from Coldridge. I see you have found a new sty to wallow in." Clara froze, the preacher's words a physical blow. Elias appeared in the doorway behind her, his face a thundercloud. "This is a house of God-fearing folk," the preacher went on, his voice rising in sermonic fervor, "and you defile it with your sin. You are a temptress, a Jezebel, cast out from civilized society." "That is enough," Elias said, his voice dangerously low. The fury in his eyes was a cold, hard flame. "You are not welcome here. Leave." "I am here to save this poor man's soul from your wicked influence," the preacher declared. "His soul does not need your brand of saving," Elias growled, taking a step forward. "And this is her home. Now get off my land before I forget the good Lord myself." There was a quiet, deadly promise in his voice that made the preacher's face pale. Without another word, the man scrambled back onto his horse and rode away, casting hateful glances over his shoulder. That evening, the mood in the cabin was somber. The preacher's visit had been a harsh reminder of the world that lay beyond their small homestead, a world that would never forgive or forget. "Do you ever think about going back?" Elias asked quietly, staring into the fire. "Back east? To where you came from?" Clara looked at him, at his strong, sad profile illuminated by the flames. She thought of the green hills of Ohio, of a life of softness and safety. It seemed like a world that belonged to someone else, a lifetime ago. She had been broken here, but she had also been remade. "Only if you come with me," she said softly. The news arrived a few days later, carried by a passing trapper on his way to the mountains. He had stopped in a mining town called Black Creek, a rough-and-tumble place known for its saloons and card games. And there, he had seen a man flashing gold, boasting about how he had outsmarted a foolish bride from back east. The man's name was Thomas Radley. A cold stillness fell over Clara. Elias watched her, his expression worried. He expected to see fear in her eyes, or perhaps the familiar shadow of humiliation. Instead, he saw something new, something hard and unsettling. Her eyes, usually the color of soft moss, had darkened to the color of stone. A cold, quiet hatred settled over her features. "He did not just leave me," she said, her voice barely a whisper, but laced with steel. "He broke me on purpose, for sport, for a story to tell in a saloon." "Clara," Elias warned, his voice gentle but firm, "let it be. He is not worth it. Revenge is a poison. It eats a person from the inside out." She turned to look at him, and the woman he saw was not the frightened girl he had found by the creek. This was a woman forged in the fires of betrayal and tempered by the harsh realities of the frontier. "Some things," she said, her voice low and steady, "deserve to be answered." The hate was a stone in her belly, cold and heavy. It was a new and unwelcome weight, but it was also a source of strength. For days, it was all she spoke of, all she thought of. The wound Thomas Radley had carved into her was no longer bleeding shame. It was festering with a cold, clear rage that demanded an accounting. "I am going to Black Creek," she announced one morning, her voice leaving no room for argument. She was not asking for permission. Elias stopped sharpening his skinning knife, the whetstone falling silent. He looked at her, his pale eyes full of a deep and troubled concern. He saw the hard set of her jaw, the flinty look in her eyes, and he knew this was not a whim. It was a purpose. "No," he said, his voice flat. "That is a fool's errand. Clara, Black Creek is no place for you. It is a pit full of rattlesnakes, and Radley is likely the most venomous of them all." "I am not afraid of him anymore," she said, and it was the truth. The fear he had instilled in her had been burned away by the fires of humiliation, leaving behind something much harder. "I just want to face him. I want to look him in the eye and make him say what he did." "And what will that change?" Elias asked, his voice rough with a frustration born of fear. Not for her safety. He had taught her to shoot, and he would be with her. But for her soul. He saw the path she was setting foot on, the dark, twisting trail of vengeance, and he knew from his own bitter experience that it led nowhere good. "It will not give you back your dowry. It will not erase what happened." "I know that," she snapped, her patience wearing thin. "This is not for my dowry. It is for me. I will not let him exist in this world believing he broke me and got away with it. I will not be his saloon story." He saw it was useless to argue. The woman standing before him was not the fragile creature he had carried into his cabin. She had been reforged, and her will was now as strong and unyielding as iron. He sighed, a long, weary sound that seemed to carry the weight of years. He was afraid of what this journey would turn her into, what this confrontation would cost her, but he was more afraid of letting her go alone. "All right," he said, the word a surrender. "We will go, but we do it my way. We ride in, you say your piece, and we ride out. No trouble." She nodded, the cold fire in her eyes banking slightly at his agreement. "No trouble," she promised, a promise he knew she had no power to keep. The journey to Black Creek took 2 days. They rode across a landscape that was vast, empty, and achingly beautiful. The plains rolled on forever, a sea of pale gold grass under a sky of impossible blue. They spoke little, the rhythmic creak of saddle leather and the plodding of the horses' hooves a steady percussion beneath the silence. A new tension hung between them, the shared intimacy of their cabin replaced by the grim purpose of their quest. On the first night, they made camp in the shelter of a small bluff. A vast, star-dusted sky stretched over them like a blanket of black velvet. Elias built a small fire, its light a tiny, flickering island of warmth in the immense, cold darkness. The flames cast dancing shadows on his scarred face, making it seem a landscape of hills and valleys, of secrets and sorrows. Clara sat across from him, hugging her knees to her chest. The anger that had propelled her had settled into a low, simmering hum, and, in its place, a quiet question had risen. She looked at this man who had become her anchor, her protector, her silent confessor. She knew the shape of his grief, but she knew so little of the life that had come before it. "Elias," she began, her voice soft in the quiet night. "Why did you never leave this place? After the fire, you could have gone anywhere. Started over." He did not look at her. He stared into the fire, his pale eyes reflecting the flames. He picked up a stick and poked at the embers, sending a shower of sparks up into the darkness. For a long time, she thought he would not answer. "I tried," he said finally, his voice a low rumble. Right after, I packed what little I had left and rode east for 3 days. I thought if I could just get away from the sight of it, from the smell of the smoke, maybe I could breathe again. He shook his head slowly, the movement barely perceptible. But it was no good. Their faces were everywhere, in the clouds, in the trees. Her voice was in the wind. I could not outrun them. He looked up then, not at her, but out into the endless star-strewn darkness beyond their small fire. His gaze was distant, haunted. "So I came back," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "I came back because this is where they are. This is the only place they exist anymore. I never left because this is where my ghosts live." His words settled over her, profound and heartbreaking. She finally understood. He was not just living on this land. He was a guardian of a memory, a keeper of a sacred, sorrowful place. He was a man living in a tomb built of earth and sky. An immense wave of tenderness washed over her, so powerful it almost brought tears to her eyes. She wanted to go to him, to hold him, but she knew this was a grief too private for comfort. So she simply sat with him in the vast, silent church of the prairie night, two lonely souls sharing the warmth of a small fire. They arrived at Black Creek the next afternoon. It was less a town and more a wound on the landscape, a chaotic sprawl of muddy streets, ramshackle tents, and hastily erected wooden buildings. The air was thick with the clamor of 1,000 frantic dreams, the clang of hammers, the braying of mules, the shouts of men, and the constant tinny music spilling from a dozen saloons. It was a place of raw, desperate energy, fueled by gold dust and cheap whiskey. Men with faces hard as rock and eyes full of a dangerous hunger watched them as they rode down the main street. Elias's hand never strayed far from the Colt at his hip. They found Thomas Radley in a saloon called the Gilded Cage. The name was a cruel joke. The place was a filthy, smoke-filled cavern, loud with the boisterous laughter of miners and the clatter of poker chips. Thomas was at a table in the back, a half-empty bottle of whiskey in front of him, a small pile of gold dust at his elbow. He was holding court, his voice loud and smug, his face flushed with drink and arrogance. He looked different from the cold, severe man she had married. This was his true self, a preening, self-satisfied peacock. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs, a wild bird trapped in a cage. For a moment, her resolve faltered. This was a mistake. Elias put a steadying hand on her arm. "We can still leave," he murmured, his voice low. She shook her head, drawing a deep breath and finding the stone of hatred in her belly. She straightened her shoulders and walked towards the table. Elias a silent, menacing shadow at her back. Thomas did not see her until she was standing right in front of him. His drunken laughter died in his throat, his smug expression melting into one of slack-jawed disbelief. "Clara?" he stammered, his eyes wide. "What in God's name are you doing here?" "I came to see you, Thomas," she said, her voice surprisingly calm and clear. It cut through the noise of the saloon, and the men at the nearby tables began to turn and watch, sensing a drama about to unfold. "I believe you have something of mine," she continued, her gaze unwavering. "The dowry you stole from me, and an apology. I want you to tell these men what you did. I want you to confess that you are a liar, a coward, and a thief." A slow, ugly smirk spread across Thomas's face as his shock gave way to a drunken, belligerent arrogance. He leaned back in his chair, looking her up and down with a contemptuous gaze that made her skin crawl. "Confess?" he scoffed, his voice loud enough for the entire saloon to hear. "My dear, I did you a favor. I liberated you from a dull and dreary future. And from the looks of it," he said, his eyes flicking to Elias, "you have not been wanting for company." He let out a short, barking laugh. "Tell me, what is the going rate for my leftover bride these days?" The insult, so public, so venomous, hung in the air. Before Clara could even react, Elias moved. It was not a walk, but a single, fluid explosion of motion. One moment he was behind her, the next, he had lunged past her, grabbed Thomas by the front of his shirt, and hauled him out of his chair. He slammed him back against the rough-hewn wall, the impact shaking a bottle from a nearby shelf. "You will apologize to the lady," Elias snarled, his voice a low, terrifying growl. His scarred face was inches from Thomas's, his pale eyes burning with a murderous rage. The arm he had pinned against Thomas's throat was corded with muscle, and a collective gasp went through the saloon. Thomas's face had gone from red to a pasty white. He clawed at Elias's arm, his eyes wide with terror. Get him off me!" he choked out. One of Thomas's companions, a burly man with a broken nose, lurched to his feet, a knife suddenly in his hand. "Let him go, friend," he said, taking a step forward. Elias did not even look at him. With his free hand, he drew his Colt, the metallic click of the hammer being cocked unnaturally loud in the suddenly silent room. He pointed it not at the man with the knife, but pressed it firmly under Thomas's chin. "This does not concern you," he said, his voice deadly calm. The fight broke out then, a chaotic eruption of flailing fists and overturned furniture as the other men at the table decided to join in. But Clara's eyes were fixed on Elias. She saw the look on his face, the cold, distant fury, the utter lack of hesitation. He was going to kill him, right here, in this filthy saloon. He was going to put a bullet in Thomas Radley's head, and the ghosts of his past would have a new companion. "Elias, no!" she screamed, grabbing his arm. "Do not! He is not worth it!" Her voice seemed to break through the red haze of his rage. He blinked, his focus shifting from Thomas to her. For a split second, he looked lost, confused, as if waking from a terrible dream. That moment of hesitation was all she needed. She pulled on his arm with all her strength, her voice pleading. "Please, Elias, let's go, please." He looked from her face to the pathetic, sputtering man pinned against the wall, and the murderous light in his eyes faded, replaced by a weary disgust. He shoved Thomas away, sending him crumpling to the floor in a heap. He holstered his pistol, grabbed Clara's hand, and pulled her through the stunned, watching crowd towards the door. They burst out of the saloon and into the muddy street, leaving the chaos behind them. Once outside, the adrenaline that had held her together vanished, and she began to tremble violently. The cold reality of what had just happened, of what had almost happened, crashed down on her. She leaned against the rough wall of the building, her legs threatening to give out. She had wanted a confrontation, an admission of guilt, but all she had found was more ugliness, a violence that had threatened to consume the one person who had shown her kindness. She slid down the wall until she was sitting in the dirt, and she buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with deep, racking sobs. Elias knelt in front of her, his face etched with concern. "He is not worth it, Clara?" Elias said softly, his own anger gone, replaced by a deep sorrow. "It is not him," she wept, her voice muffled by her hands. "It is me. I brought this. I brought you here. I wanted him to suffer. Elias, I wanted to hurt him the way he hurt me." She looked up at him, her eyes swimming with tears of self-loathing. "But I do not want to be like him. I do not want to be a person who finds satisfaction in cruelty." He said nothing. He simply reached out and gently brushed a muddy strand of hair from her face, his touch a silent offering of comfort and understanding. He had seen the poison, and he had seen her turn away from it. They rode back to the homestead in silence, but it was a different silence than before. It was a silence of shared experience, of a crisis faced and survived. The anger was gone, washed away by the ugly reality of violence. When they arrived back at the cabin, it felt like coming home for the first time. The simple, quiet space was a sanctuary, a haven of peace in a brutal world. In the weeks that followed, a quiet, domestic rhythm settled over them. There was a new warmth between them, an intimacy forged in shared danger. They worked side by side, their movements easy and familiar, They talked more, sharing small stories of their pasts, filling in the empty spaces. They slept in the same bed every night, and his arms around her were a comfort against the darkness, a promise of the morning to come. For the first time since she had left Ohio, Clara felt safe. She felt a fragile, tentative peace begin to settle in her heart. One morning, Elias rode to the nearest way station to trade some furs for supplies. When he returned, he was carrying a letter. It was from the sheriff in a neighboring county, addressed to the residents of his homestead. His face was grim as he handed it to her. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The letter was brief and formal. It was an official notice informing them that a man by the name of Thomas Radley had been killed 2 nights prior in a bar brawl in Black Creek over a gambling debt. His identity had been confirmed by a letter found in his pocket, a letter bearing her name, a formal notice of their marriage. Clara read the words over and over, but they would not sink in. He was dead. The man who had ruined her, who had been the source of so much pain and anger, was gone from the world. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and she had to grip the edge of the table to steady herself. Elias watched her, his expression unreadable. "Are you all right?" She looked up at him, her eyes wide and blank. "I should feel free," she said, her voice a hollow whisper. "I should feel relieved, vindicated, something." She shook her head, a profound and bewildering emptiness opening up inside her. "But I feel nothing, absolutely nothing." The stone of hate that she had carried in her belly for so long was gone, but its absence did not leave her feeling lighter. It left a cold, gaping void. That night, she could not sleep. She lay in the darkness, staring at the ceiling, the sheriff's words replaying in her mind. Thomas Radley was dead. The story was over, but there was no triumph, no closure, only a vast, silent emptiness. She began to shiver, a deep, internal cold that had nothing to do with the night air. Elias, sensing her distress, turned and pulled her against him, wrapping his arms around her. He did not speak. He did not offer empty words of comfort. He simply held her, his body a warm, solid presence in the dark. He held her in silence as she stared into the void, his steadfast presence the only thing keeping her from being swallowed by it. Outside, the wind sighed through the pines, but inside the cabin, the only sound was the soft crackle and hiss of the dying embers in the hearth. The emptiness left by Thomas Radley's death was slowly, quietly filled by peace. The days grew longer, and the first green shoots of spring pushed their way through the thawing earth with a stubborn, miraculous tenacity. For the first time, the cabin felt not like a temporary refuge, but a home, its walls saturated with the warmth of shared meals, soft laughter, and a deepening, unspoken love. The silence that had once been a barrier between them was now a comfortable language, a shared space where their 2 solitudes could coexist without loneliness. Clara planted a small garden of hardy vegetables near the door, her hands in the cool, dark soil, a connection to a life she thought she had lost. Elias began repairing the old barn. His hammer blows a steady, rhythmic heartbeat that spoke of a future he was finally allowing himself to imagine. The ghosts were still there, but their voices had softened to whispers, their sorrowful presence a part of the landscape rather than a constant, pressing weight. But in the west, peace was a fickle and transient thing, a shallow pool of calm water on the edge of a raging river. The threat, when it came, did not arrive with the thunder of hooves or the crack of a rifle. It came on a crisp spring morning in the form of 2 men in dusty suits, their faces wearing the smug, impassive masks of hired authority. They rode up to the cabin as if they owned the very ground beneath them. The taller of the 2 men, a man with a drooping mustache and cold, reptilian eyes, dismounted and produced a sheaf of papers. "Elias Stone?" he asked, though it was not a question. Elias, who had been splitting wood, rested his axe and nodded, his body going still and watchful. Clara came to the doorway, a familiar knot of dread tightening in her stomach. "I am an agent for Mr. Silas Croft," the man announced. "Mr. Croft has recently acquired the title to this parcel of land, as documented by a federal land grant filed in the territorial capital." He held out the papers. "This is a legal notice of eviction. You have 1 week to vacate the premises." Elias did not take the papers. He stared at the man. His pale eyes narrowed. "I have a deed to this land, signed and filed 10 years ago." The man smirked, a small, unpleasant twisting of his lips. "Deeds can be contested. Claims can be superseded. Mr. Croft's claim is newer and, according to the territorial judge, more valid. It is a simple matter of law." It was not law, it was power. Silas Croft was a name whispered with a mixture of fear and resentment across the territory. He was a land baron, a man who devoured smaller homesteads the way a wolf devours sheep, using a combination of forged documents, bribed officials, and the quiet, persuasive threat of hired guns. This was the West's cruel justice, a system where the man with the most money and the least morals wrote the law. "Now, Mr. Croft is a reasonable man," the agent continued, his voice taking on a patronizing tone. "He is prepared to offer you a nominal fee for any improvements you have made, to avoid any unpleasantness." The threat hung in the air, as sharp and ugly as a rusty nail. Elias's face was a mask of stone, but Clara could see the flicker of something in his eyes, a familiar, weary resignation. He was a man who knew how to lose. He had lost a wife, a child, a life. What was a piece of land compared to that? She saw him beginning to fold inward, to retreat to that desolate place where he accepted the blows of a cruel fate. But she would not. The woman who had been broken by one man's cruelty would not be broken by another's greed. Before Elias could speak, she stepped forward. "You can tell Mr. Croft that this land is not for sale," she said, her voice clear and ringing with a cold fury that startled both the agents and Elias. "And you can tell him that if he wants it, he will have to come and take it from us." The agent's eyes widened in surprise, then narrowed in contempt as he took in the sight of her. A woman, daring to speak. He let out a short, humorless laugh. "Ma'am, I suggest you leave these matters to the men." "I am," she said, her gaze as sharp as a shard of glass. "I am speaking to you, am I not?" The man's face flushed with anger. He threw the papers on the ground. 1 week, he snarled. "Then we will be back to help you move." He and his partner mounted their horses and galloped away, leaving the eviction notice to flutter in the dust. A heavy silence descended. Elias stared at the papers on the ground as if they were a coiled snake. "We should pack," he said, his voice hollow. "There is no fighting a man like Croft." "No?" Clara said, turning to him, her eyes blazing. "We are not running. I have been run out of a town, run out of my own life. I will not be run out of my home." She took a step closer, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. "This is not just a piece of land, Elias. This is not just a cabin. This is the place where you kept your memories safe. This is the place where you saved me. This is your home." She took another step, her voice softening but losing none of its intensity. She reached out and touched his arm. "Our home, and I will not let him take it." Her words, her fierce and unwavering resolve, were a spark in the darkness of his fatalism. He looked at her, at this woman who had somehow stitched his broken life back together, and felt a slow, unfamiliar fire begin to burn in his own chest. She was right. He had been a guardian of ghosts for too long. It was time to become a defender of the living. They did not have an army. They had something better, the loyalty of those who lived by a code older than any law written on paper. The next day, Elias rode out, leaving a grimly determined Clara to watch the homestead. He returned at dusk with their allies. Jedediah and Silas Miller were brothers, cattlemen in their late 60s with faces like cracked leather and eyes that had seen 1,000 sunrises over the plains. They owed Elias for a time he had helped them fight off a cattle plague that would have ruined them. They arrived with rifles across their saddles and a quiet, unshakable sense of duty. Martha Stewart was a widow in her 50s who had run her own ranch since her husband's death 15 years prior. She was a small, bird-like woman, but she carried a long-barreled shotgun with an ease that suggested it was a natural extension of her arm. She had faced down wolves, droughts, and men like Croft, and she had survived them all. She came because she knew that when the wolves circled one homestead, they would eventually circle them all. The last to arrive was a man named Hawk. He was a scout, half-native, a man who moved with the silent grace of a shadow and whose knowledge of the land was absolute. Elias had once pulled him from a bear trap and saved his leg, and Hawk's loyalty was as deep and unyielding as the canyons he roamed. They gathered in the cabin that night, a small, grim council of war. Over coffee, they planned their defense, Hawk sketching a map of the surrounding terrain in the dirt on the floor, pointing out the best lines of sight, the hidden gullies, the natural choke points. Their numbers were few, but they had the land on their side. As the men talked, Clara moved about the cabin, preparing for the siege. She gathered every blanket, tore strips of cloth for bandages, and boiled water. Her mind focused and clear. While searching for more cloth in the old wooden chest at the foot of the bed, her fingers brushed against something cold and metallic. Curious, she drew it out. It was a small, silver locket, tarnished with age. Her heart gave a small, painful squeeze. She knew, instinctively, what it was. With trembling fingers, she opened it. Inside were two tiny, faded tin-type portraits. On one side was a woman with a kind, gentle smile and dark hair swept up from her face. On the other was a small boy, no older than 4, with a mischievous grin and Elias's pale, serious eyes. Sarah and Daniel. She stared at the images, at the faces of the ghosts who had shared this cabin with her, and felt a wave of profound, aching sadness. They were not just a story, not just a source of Elias's pain. They were real. They had lived and breathed and laughed in this very room. Her name was Sarah. Elias's voice, quiet and close behind her, made her jump. She turned, the open locket still in her hand, her face flushed with guilt. "I am sorry," she stammered. "I did not mean to pry." He shook his head, a sad, gentle smile touching his lips. He came and sat on the edge of the bed beside her, his gaze fixed on the locket. "It is all right." He reached out and gently touched the portrait of his wife. She loved this place, said the sky was big enough to hold all her dreams. He then touched the picture of his son. "And Daniel, he was a wild thing, full of laughter. He would have loved that you planted a garden." They sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of the past and the threat of the future filling the small space. It was the first time they had spoken of them so openly, not as sources of pain, but as people who were loved and missed. Clara's throat grew tight. She looked from the smiling face of the woman in the locket to the scarred, sad face of the man beside her. A cold, deep-seated fear, a fear she had not dared to give voice to, finally surfaced. "I am afraid," she whispered, her voice trembling, "that I will never be enough, that I will always be a shadow living in her house, a ghost trying to fill a space that is not mine." Elias turned to look at her, his expression serious. He took the locket from her hand and closed it, his fingers wrapping around hers. He held her gaze, and his pale eyes were full of a raw, honest sincerity that took her breath away. "Clara," he said, his voice low and steady. "Sarah is a memory, a beautiful, painful memory that I will carry for the rest of my days. But you are real. You are the woman who pulled me from the grave I was digging for myself. You are the woman who taught me how to breathe again." He squeezed her hand, his thumb stroking the back of her palm. "You are not a shadow." He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. "You already are enough." His words were a balm on the oldest, deepest wound in her soul. Tears welled in her eyes, tears of relief and a love so profound it was almost painful. He tilted her chin up and kissed her, a kiss of infinite tenderness and profound gratitude. Later that night, long after the others had settled into their bedrolls, they made love. It was nothing like the desperate, sorrowful coupling of their first time together. This was a slow, deliberate act of healing. It was a rediscovery, a confirmation of the promise his words had made. His hands moved over her with a gentle reverence, and her touch was a silent vow, a promise to cherish the man he was, not just the man he had been. It was a quiet, sacred act of two souls choosing a future, a tender and healing love that finally, truly, let the morning in. The Baron's men arrived 3 days later, at dawn. Hawk had spotted their dust cloud from miles away, giving them time to prepare. They were a small army, at least 15 of them, a collection of hard-faced men with rifles in their hands and casual cruelty in their eyes. They stopped at the creek bed that marked the edge of Elias's property, a clear line drawn in the sand. Elias, flanked by the Miller brothers, stood on the porch of the cabin. Martha was positioned at the barn door, her shotgun resting in the crook of her arm. Clara was at the cabin window, the rifle Elias had taught her to use resting on the sill, its stock cool and solid against her cheek. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her hands were steady. The man with the drooping mustache, the agent from before, rode forward. "Last chance, Stone!" he shouted. "Leave now, and no one gets hurt." "This is my land," Elias shouted back, his voice clear and strong. "You are the ones trespassing. Turn around and ride away now." The agent laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. He turned to his men. "Burn them out," he ordered. The world exploded in a cacophony of gunfire. A bullet splintered the porch post next to Elias's head, and he and the Millers dove for cover. From the barn, Martha's shotgun roared, its blast sending 2 of the hired guns scrambling back. Clara took a breath, sighted down the barrel of her rifle as Elias had taught her, and squeezed the trigger. She aimed not for a man, but for the horse of one of the riders, hoping to create chaos. The horse screamed and fell, and the men's organized line began to break. The fight settled into a tense, deadly rhythm. The sharp crack of rifles, the answering boom of the shotgun, the whiz of bullets cutting through the air. One of Croft's men cried out and fell from his saddle, but they were badly outnumbered. A bullet tore through Silas Miller's shoulder, and he grunted in pain, slumping against the cabin wall. Jedediah dragged his brother into cover, his face a grim mask of fury. Clara saw it happen, and her fear was instantly replaced by a cold, clear focus. While Jedediah tended to his brother, she kept firing, her movements becoming practiced and sure. Load, aim, fire. She was no longer just defending a home, she was defending her family. In the chaos, Elias moved to a new position behind a stack of firewood, trying to get a better angle on the men who were trying to flank the barn. He did not see the rider who had dismounted and crept through the tall grass on the other side. The man raised his pistol, taking careful aim at Elias's exposed back. Clara saw him. Time seemed to slow down. There was no time to shout a warning, no time to reload. There was only instinct. With a cry, she pushed away from the window. Grabbing the heavy cast-iron skillet from the stove, she burst out onto the porch, a wild, fearless figure, and flung the skillet with all her might, just as the man was about to fire. It spun through the air and struck the gunman's arm with a sickening thud. His shot went wide, burying itself harmlessly in the dirt. Elias whirled around, his rifle coming up, and fired a single shot that sent the man staggering back into the grass. Elias looked at her, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock, terror, and overwhelming awe. The woman he had once found collapsed and broken had just saved his life with a cooking pan. The loss of another man and the unexpected ferocity of the defense seemed to break the attacker's will. The agent screamed curses at his men, but they began to fall back, firing sporadically as they retreated. Within minutes, they were gone, leaving 2 of their own behind as they galloped away in a cloud of dust. An eerie silence fell over the homestead, broken only by Silas's pained groans. The fight was over. As the adrenaline drained away, a violent, uncontrollable trembling took hold of Clara. The rifle slipped from her nerveless fingers and clattered to the porch. The reality of what had just happened, the gunfire, the wounded man, the fact that she had shot at another human being, crashed down on her in a tidal wave of horror. She sank to her knees, her body shaking apart, just as a cloud of dust appeared on the horizon. This time, the sheriff and 2 deputies, summoned by a boy Martha had sent at the first sign of trouble. Elias was at her side. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her tight against his chest. The sheriff, arriving too late to be a hero but just in time to be a witness, took one look at the scene, the wounded man, the bodies of the hired guns, the eviction notice still lying in the dirt, and made a pragmatic decision. He declared Croft's claim fraudulent and Elias's deed the only one he would recognize. But Clara barely heard him. All she knew was the solid, steady beat of Elias's heart against her ear, and the safety of his arms around her. She clung to him, the trembling finally subsiding into silent, exhausted tears. He held her, stroking her hair, his own heart still hammering from the fight and the near-fatal bullet. "It is over now," he whispered into her hair, his voice thick with emotion. "It is all over." The violence of the standoff, like a sudden, violent storm, had washed the land clean. In its aftermath, a profound and quiet spring unfolded. The last of the snow receded from the hollows, melting into the thirsty earth and swelling the creek until it sang a new, cheerful song. The skeletal branches of the cottonwood trees began to soften with the pale green haze of new buds. The air, for so long sharp and sterile with cold, now carried the rich, damp scent of life returning. For the first time, the vast, empty plains did not feel desolate. They felt full of a quiet, patient promise. Clara and Elias moved through this gentle reawakening side by side, their lives weaving together into a single, strong thread. The rhythms of the homestead were their new language. They mended the fences that had been damaged in the fight, their hands often brushing, their movements a silent, easy dance. They cleared the fields for planting, the work hard and honest, grounding them in the solid reality of the earth. There was a simple, profound satisfaction in their shared labor, a sense of building something real and lasting out of the wreckage of their pasts. One afternoon, Clara took a small spade and dug a patch of earth beneath the cabin window. Elias watched from the porch, where he was mending a piece of tack, as she carefully planted a handful of wildflower seeds she had found in a forgotten corner of the mercantile. It was a small, almost frivolous act in a world that prized practicality above all else. But as he watched her gently firming the soil with her hands, her face soft with concentration, he understood. It was an act of faith. It was a defiant declaration that there was room in this hard land not just for survival, but for beauty. She was planting roots, not just for the flowers, but for herself. She was making this place, once a shelter, then a fortress, into a home. News of the fight at the stone homestead had traveled faster than any preacher or trapper. The story became a piece of local lore, a tale of 2 stubborn people who had stood their ground against a greedy land baron and won. In the telling, Clara was no longer the disgraced bride or the hermit's woman. She was the woman who had fought alongside the men, the woman who had saved Elias Stone's life with a skillet. She had, in the brutal arithmetic of the West, earned her place. The change in the townsfolk was not sudden, but it was real. It came in small, quiet gestures. One day, a woman from the church, one who had previously stared at Clara with cold judgment, stopped her on the street in Coldridge. The woman's face was flushed, her eyes averted. We were wrong about you. Mrs. Stone," she stammered, using a name Clara had never worn. "What you did, it was brave." The apology was clumsy, but it was sincere. A few days later, a young girl with wide, curious eyes appeared at the cabin door, holding out a small, warm loaf of bread wrapped in a clean cloth. "My ma sent this," she whispered, before turning and running away as if startled by her own boldness. Clara stood in the doorway, the warm bread in her hands, and felt a stinging in her eyes. It was more than just bread. It was a token of acceptance, an offering of community. The walls of her isolation, once so high and insurmountable, were beginning to crumble. Her own transformation found its truest expression not with a rifle, but with a book. A miner who lived a few miles down the creek, a man whose respect Elias had earned years ago, came to the cabin one evening, his hat in his hands. He had 2 young daughters, he explained, bright and quick, but with no school to go to. They were growing up as wild as the land itself. He had heard that Clara was from the East, that she was educated. He wondered, humbly, if she might be willing to teach them to read. A light came on in Clara's eyes, a glow of quiet purpose that Elias had never seen before. It was a piece of her old life, a part of the gentle, educated girl she had been, that she could now reclaim and put to use in her new one. Twice a week, the 2 girls, their faces scrubbed clean and their hair slicked down with water, would come to the cabin. They would sit at the rough-hewn table, their small, work-roughened fingers tracing the letters in a worn copy of McGuffey's Reader that Elias had owned. Clara was a patient and gentle teacher. She saw in their eager, hungry minds a reflection of her own thirst for a life beyond mere survival. As she watched them sound out their first words, a sense of profound contentment settled over her. She was no longer just a survivor, a victim, or a fighter. She was a teacher. She was a woman of value and purpose, a purpose she had forged for herself out of the ashes of her old life. While Clara nurtured the minds of the young girls and the flowers in her garden, Elias turned his attention to the old barn. It was a solid structure, but it bore the scars of time and neglect. The roof sagged in one corner, and a door hung crookedly on a single hinge. For 5 years, it had been little more than a shelter for his horse and a storehouse for his ghosts. Now, as he began the slow, methodical work of repairing it, he saw it not as it was, but as it could be. He replaced the rotting timbers, his saw and hammer moving with a new energy. He straightened the door and forged new hinges in the fire. With each nail he drove, with each board he set in place, he felt as if he were rebuilding a part of himself. He was no longer just maintaining a memorial to a life that was over. He was building for a future he was finally daring to imagine. He began to dream of filling the empty stalls with more livestock, of a hayloft full to bursting, of a home that was not just a shelter for 2, but a place fit for a family again. The thought did not bring the familiar, sharp pang of guilt. It brought a quiet, hopeful warmth that spread through his chest, a feeling he had thought was lost to him forever. Their life had found a peaceful, steady rhythm, but the scars of the past, like the fault lines in rock, ran deep. One night, Clara woke with a strangled cry, her body rigid, her heart pounding in her chest. She was back in the cold, stuffy room above the saloon, the tinny piano music mocking her, the bed beside her vast and empty. The humiliation was a physical thing, a cold hand squeezing the air from her lungs. She sat bolt upright, gasping for breath, the dream so real she could still smell the stale whiskey and cheap perfume. Elias was awake instantly, his hand on her back. "Clara?" he whispered in the darkness. "It is all right. You are here. You are safe." His voice, his touch, were an anchor. She turned and collapsed against him, burying her face in his chest, her body shaking with deep, racking sobs. The dream had torn open the old wound, reminding her of the fragile foundation upon which her new life was built. He held her, stroking her hair, his presence a solid, unwavering comfort. He did not speak, simply letting her cry, holding the broken pieces of her until the storm passed. When her sobs finally subsided into shuddering breaths, she lay limp in his arms, exhausted. "He tore me open," she whispered, her voice a raw, ragged thing against his skin. "That night, I felt like he reached inside me and just tore me apart. I was in pieces." She clung to him, her fingers digging into the fabric of his shirt. "But you," she said, her voice thick with a gratitude so profound it was almost painful. "You stitched me back together, piece by piece. You were just so quiet and so patient. You did not even know you were doing it, but you did. You stitched me back together." He held her tighter, his throat aching with an emotion he could not name. He had thought he was just surviving, just putting one foot in front of the other. He had not realized that in saving her, he had also been saving himself. The next evening, they sat on the porch, watching the sun set. The sky was a breathtaking canvas of red-orange and deep purple, the colors bleeding into one another over the dark, rolling line of the plains. A comfortable silence stretched between them. Elias cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet air. He turned to her, and she saw a nervousness in his eyes she had never seen before, not even in the face of Croft's men. He held a small, awkwardly carved wooden object in his hand. "I am not a man of words. Clara," he began, his voice rough and hesitant. He looked down at his hands, then back up at her. "The life I had before, I never thought I could have another. I thought all that was left for me was remembering." He took a deep breath. "But you changed that. You brought life back into this place, back into me. You are the strongest, bravest person I have ever known." He held out his hand. In his palm was a small, crudely carved bird, its wings outstretched. It was clumsy, but it was made with a loving, patient hand. "I do not have much to offer," he said, his voice dropping so low she had to lean in to hear him. "Just this land, and my name, and a promise that I will spend the rest of my days trying to be worthy of you." He finally met her eyes, his own pale gaze full of a raw, heartfelt plea. "Clara, will you marry me?" Tears welled in her eyes, blurring the beautiful, fiery sunset. It was the most awkward, earnest, and perfect proposal she could have ever imagined. She thought of her first wedding, a cold, public transaction that had ended in ruin, and she thought of this, a quiet question asked on a porch at sunset by a man who had seen the very worst of her and had loved her anyway. She took the small wooden bird from his hand, her fingers closing around it. "Yes," she whispered, her voice thick with tears. She looked at him, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. "Yes, only if you keep holding me until the morning." A slow, wondrous smile spread across his face, a smile that reached his eyes and banished the last of the shadows. He leaned in and kissed her, a gentle, reverent kiss that sealed their promise under the vast, painted sky. Their wedding took place a week later, just as the sun was beginning its descent. There was no church, no crowd, no fanfare. There was just the two of them, standing in the tall grass behind the cabin, with the endless sky as their witness. Jedediah Miller, who was also a justice of the peace, read the words from a small, worn book, his voice a low, steady rumble. Clara wore a simple blue dress, the color of the prairie sky at twilight. Elias wore a clean shirt, his dark hair combed back from his face. They stood before Jedediah, their hands clasped together. Their hands trembled, not with fear, but with the profound, overwhelming gravity of the moment. They were two broken, scarred people who had found in each other a love strong enough to heal. They made their vows in quiet, heartfelt voices, their hearts wide open to the promise of a shared future. As night fell, a blanket of stars emerged in the darkening sky. Jedediah and the others departed, leaving them in the quiet solitude of their homestead. Elias turned to her. a look of profound love on his face. Without a word, he bent down and scooped her up into his arms, as easily as if she weighed nothing at all. He carried her towards the warm, inviting light of the cabin. She clung to him, her arms wrapped around his neck, her head resting on his shoulder. She looked back at the darkness that was gathering over the plains, a vast, empty blackness that had once terrified her. It had been a symbol of her loneliness, of her abandonment, of a world without hope. But now, held safe in the arms of this quiet, steady man, it held no fear for her. He carried her across the threshold and into the warm, familiar space of their home. As he gently set her down, she looked up at him, her eyes shining in the soft lamplight. She reached up and touched the scar on his face, her fingers tracing the path of his old wound. "This time," she whispered, her voice full of a peaceful, unwavering certainty, "I am not afraid of the dark." Thank you for listening to our story around the campfire tonight. We would love to hear where you are tuning in from in the comments, so we can all connect. Please subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.